Good afternoon. Our speaker today is Professor Paul Heald, who is a visiting fellow at the faculty here today, here for this term and next term. He's from the University of Illinois School of Law, and he'll be speaking to us today on the intriguing topic of do bad things happen when works fall into the public domain.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Yin, and thank you to Sipple for inviting me, and thank you for secreting yourself down in the dungeon when the sun is shining and you could all be out sunbathing for the first time in a week. I appreciate you coming. I'm going to talk for about a half an hour. I'm going to do a little bit of review of some of my prior empirical work, and then talk about a major study involving audiobooks that I've just finished, which should be published really in the next couple of weeks, and then give a preview of some work that I'm in the middle of right now, all of which relates to the question of what happens to copyrighted works when they fall into the public domain. The reason why it matters, apart from just our curiosity, is that we have copyright owners basically circling the globe, lobbying various legislatures and trying to convince them that the copyright term for existing works should be extended retroactively. Disney is particularly active in trying to continually get 20 extra years of protection for works that already exist. They failed in England and Japan, succeeded in the United States, where no U.S. works have fallen into the public domain since 1998, and none will again until 2018. What's interesting about the debate and why the status of works after they enter the public domain matters is because incentives to create are not an issue in the debate over retroactive term extension for works that already exist, right? The works already exist. They don't need to be incentivized. All the arguments about whether protection needs to be extended or not turn on whether good or bad things happen to works when they fall into the public domain. Those lobbying for copyright term extension make three kinds of arguments. They identify three sorts of negative possibilities for works entering the public domain. We can take a look at them briefly one by one here. First is the fear of underexploitation, that once a work no longer has an owner, nobody really has an adequate incentive to exploit it anymore because the monopoly incentive has disappeared. Landis and Posner make this argument quite strenuously in a work called Indefinitely Renewable Copyright, basically arguing that the absence of copyright will lead to less availability and the disappearance of works formerly protected by copyright. And this is the primary argument accepted by the U.S. Congress when it decided to extend 20 extra years of protection for existing works. The second sort of fear is exactly the opposite. That is, once a work falls into the public domain, it's somehow going to be overexploited, right? It's free now for anybody and everybody to use, and just like the common field in England being overgrazed, the theory goes, again proposed by Landis and Posner, that even novels or pieces of music could be overused, overgrazed in the same way that a pool of oil or gas or the common field in the middle of the English village might be abused if nobody has a property right to maintain efficient exploitation. The third fear, and the one that's the subject, really the primary and most interesting subject of the audiobook study we'll talk about in a little bit, is a fear of a different kind of overexploitation, not a fear of too much use, but rather of discrete, very inappropriate uses. The examples almost always given in the literature are if a work falls into the public domain, usually a famous character, somebody's going to make a porn movie out of it, or a porn comic book or something like that. The fear is that a work falling in the public domain won't have a shepherd, basically, to make sure that it's continually used in appropriate and value-enhancing ways. That when it's available for free use from anybody, its value will be tarnished, and its value to the public perhaps eventually destroyed. Now, all three of these fears are empirical assumptions, right? They're assertions by economists what will happen to copyrighted works when they fall into the public domain, and therefore they're testable. We can make observations and determine, in fact, what exactly happens to works when they fall into the public domain. Do they become more available, less available? Are they tarnished? Some existing work prior to my audiobook study is tends to generally cut in the opposite direction of the fears that we've just mentioned. An early study by Tim Brooks for the Library of Congress looked at popular recordings between 1890 and 1964 and just measured which had been converted to a CD format. Right, the CD format much more durable. It's what we listen to now. What famous works have been digitized, and who, importantly, is doing the digitization. They found 64% still only available in vinyl or wax, 14% converted by owners, copyright owners, to a digital format that's available to the public, 22% converted into digital format for the public by non-owners, right? The suggestion being, well, it looks like people who don't own copyrights do just as good or perhaps a better job of digitizing works than copyright owners themselves. Maybe we don't need an extension of a property right to make sure these old pieces of music survive into the 21st and 22nd century. Second study, and this is important for the current audiobook study because it uses the same titles. I did a couple of years ago. I looked at best-selling books on either side of the American, what you might think of as the American public domain divide. It's easier to do this kind of research in the U.S. because all works before 1923 in the United States are in the public domain. Works after 1923, at least well-known ones, are almost always protected by copyright. We didn't have at this point in time a life of the author sort of system. So it's really easy to sort of create a set of best-selling books, which I did from 1913 to 22, all of which are in the public domain. 173 books from the 10 years after 1923, all of which are protected by copyright. It becomes possible then to study the behavior of these two sets of books and see whether works falling into the public domain behave any differently than works that remain under copyright. And what we did basically was look at in print status, a number of editions, a number of publishers at 5-year intervals in the books and print database. And what we found, this here is percentage of works that are in print. So this is sort of the availability measure. And this is the time beginning 1988 to 2006. And we started in 88 because that's when works from 1913, the earliest works in our database, started to fall into the public domain. Between 88 and 2000, there's no statistically significant difference between in the availability of the public domain works and the copyrighted works. So there doesn't seem to be any difference at all. Public domain status, copyright status doesn't seem to affect the availability of works. And up till 2000, after 2000, you have this significant divergence, right? Almost 100% of the public domain books in the study are in print by the year 2006, whereas only 74% of the copyrighted books are in print and still available in new editions to the public. This is a statistically significant positive public domain effect that we measure after the year 2000. My guess, and you can only guess as to why, I don't think it's a coincidence that this is when really cheap scanning technology and really cheap software for formatting works became available. I think it became much cheaper to pull a public domain work out of the library and actually put it in, make it available in digital form after 2000. So positive public domain effect shown in this study. There's also twice as many editions by twice as many publishers of the public domain sample. Interestingly, the price of the 171 public domain books, 173 copyrighted books, are almost exactly the same, literally to the dollar. So there's no pricing effect until you break out the top 20 titles, top 20 most popular titles of both the public domain and the copyrighted set. In that situation, you do have a significant price differential. Not surprisingly, the public domain books are cheaper. It doesn't surprise you, but it surprises economists. The existing paper is all arguing that there's no price difference at all. Here's a snapshot which I think captures this phenomenon. This is a new study that I'm working on rather than looking backwards at works that were popular at the beginning of the last century, I'm looking at works currently available in the Amazon warehouse. I had a student write a software program that crawls through Amazon.com, collecting only new books available only from Amazon, not from their trading partners. No used books at all. These are books from Amazon itself. And we took a sample of 2,500 fiction works and determined, when were these works first published? What sort of books are in the Amazon warehouse? Well, not surprisingly, we have a lot from the decade of the 2000s, right? The most recent books, not surprisingly, tending to dominate what's in the Amazon warehouse. You had a tremendously quick drop-off to books from the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s. What happens when you hit 1920? The bar starts to go up again, right? Because these books are in the public domain, and you have as many books from the years 1900 to 1910 available brand new at Amazon as you do works from 2000 to 2010. And you can sort of see the slope, especially striking these 1850. There's more books from there's 3 times as many books from the 1850s for sale by Amazon as books from the 1950s. All right. So again, a very positive public domain effect. And it gets even worse if you normalize this. Now notice, right, this is striking, especially since there are way fewer books published in 1850 than 1950, right? Many more presses churning out many more books in 1950. If you normalize to take into account for how many books were published in each of these decades, it gets even more distorted. All right, so lack of availability doesn't seem to be a problem caused by books falling to the public domain, at least. Also, I've looked at musical compositions from the same era using basically the same kind of technique. Unfortunately, you can't get sales data because it's proprietary. ASCAP will not cooperate with me. They hate me and won't give me data on airtime. So the best I could do was look at songs as they appear in movies, because the IMDb.com database is open to the public. It has 380,000 films on it and has the soundtracks for all of those films. So you can at least try to measure whether when a song falls into the public domain, it's more or less likely to appear in a film. Okay, one can do that much. We looked at 74 songs that appeared in at least 4 movies between 1968 and 2008. And not to spend too much time on this data, I wish I have a fancier demonstration where I can click on these and we can listen to Alexander's Ragtime Band or Danny Boy. Can anybody whistle Colonel Bogey's March?
No whistle.
You can't whistle it, but you know it, right? So the Bridge Over the River Kwai, we have fantastic whistling at the beginning there. I will not attempt that for you, but if you want to take a look at the slides, you can see sort of what songs we're looking at appearing in movies from 1968 to 2008. Again, we chose that because the mid date there is 1988. That's when work started falling into the public domain, and by choosing those years, lets us track, what happens to how frequently do works appear in movies when they're protected by copyright, how frequently do they appear after they fall into the public domain. So what we found, which is really interesting, if you look at public domain songs, I'm not going to explain the numbers too much, but this is the bar that measures the frequency of appearance while these songs from 1913 to 22 were protected by copyright, right? So while they're in copyright, they're in this many movies. When they fall into the public domain, they appear in this many movies. This looks like a dramatic finding, another positive public domain effect, but we had to control, right, for the possibility that in general more music from this era was appearing in films, or more likely that the IMDb database has more recent movies in it than it has older movies. And we found out that copyrighted songs that were always under copyright, that have never fallen in the public domain, behave much the same way. There was also, over time, a tremendous increase in the use of those songs in movies also. It looks like there's more of an increase here. There is technically, but when you run the regression analysis, which I will not bore you with, it turns out the difference in increase is not statistically significant, which is fine for my purposes. It shows that works aren't less available when they fall into the public domain. That's not my phone. I turned it off, I promise. All right. So we ran the data for all the songs that appeared in 1, 2, and 3 films. They behave just the same way. I thought maybe I could find a positive public domain effect by considering box office, right? Because I got a great question at the University of Chicago from somebody who said, well, what if a song appears, the public domain songs are all appearing in tiny, obscure art films that nobody sees, while the copyrighted songs are appearing in blockbuster movies that everybody sees. So in other words, maybe the copyrighted songs are still more available. So we reran all the numbers, we tracked down the box office data for all the movies, reran the regressions, and there's still no statistically significant difference between the way the copyrighted and public domain songs behave. Now, we were, I think, in this study able to answer at least one question about overgrazing. So far, we've just talked about undergrazing. Right? You notice here that when works fall in the public domain, they become more used. Maybe that's evidence of too much use somehow, evidence of a tragedy of the commons in the making. It turns out, though, if you look at the raw data, you find out the copyright owners license their compositions on average once every 3.3 years. And the public domain compositions are only used once every 3.8 years. So in comparison to the copyrighted works, the public domain works actually aren't being used at a higher rate. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence of overgrazing. And you don't see that either if you look at the, just pick out the most popular songs from a particular era. So, Danny Boy appears basically in one movie a year from 93 to 2000. You look at, however, copyrighted songs in the 1930s. Happy Days Are Here Again appears in 34 movies in one decade. Copyrighted songs more recently appear slightly more frequency. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence that when songs fall into the public domain, they appear in too many movies. We get sick of them in the background. At least if we do get sick of them, we know copyright ownership wouldn't change that, because copyright owners are even more likely to encourage their songs to appear in films at an even higher rate. All right, that leaves debasement and the actual new study that I wanted to talk about today. No one really has attempted to measure whether this phenomenon occurs, whether somehow goods get tarnished or lose their value when they fall into the public domain. There really wasn't enough data points in the music study. What you'd expect, right, if debasement happens, you'd expect sort of a song or a book to become increasingly available, then the debasing work happens. The bad movie is made from the book, or the porn comic book comes out, and then you should see less availability as the public no longer wants to experience the work that's been tarnished by the alleged debasing act. We don't really have enough musical data points to measure that. In the book market, at least looking at the top 20 public domain books, it's a steeply sloping curve that goes ever upwards, so no sign of a dip when a famous book gets made into a lousy movie, perhaps. I did in a prior paper. It occurred to me that after reading, this just doesn't indicate my general interest in pornography, but since all of the examples involve porn, I decided to look through the Internet Adult Film Database. This is actually not a porn site. It is a crazy, obsessive person who's done for porn films what IMDb does for regular films. It's got thousands of titles. It has characters and what they do described, and it's an interesting database to say the least. But I ran through some famous characters just to see if the existence of porn films about them somehow had ruined their value for us. And it's astonishing, how many films involve Cinderella or Snow White. Santa's been in over 30 porn movies. It seems unlikely, and if you run any Greek god, I didn't actually count because there were too many that came up. If you run any Greek god or Greek character, you get so much gay porn that you can't even count it, right? So anecdotally, we suspect that this debasement argument is not particularly strong, right? Some of our most famous and continually usable and valuable characters have already appeared in porn movies, but that's very anecdotal. It's not very scientific, and no economist is going to pay attention to me if I just talk about my cruising through this database. So I came up with a different idea while I was exercising. I get very bored exercising, so I listen to audiobooks, and I'm also very cheap, so I listen to free audiobooks from LibriVox.org. And I noticed that some of the recordings are really quite excellent. They're all amateur recordings, and they're all available for free at LibriVox.org. It's thousands and thousands of titles, but some of them are terrible. Right. I couldn't listen to Jane Eyre when she looked out into the ocean and saw the Hebrides Islands. Right. It was too much. So it occurred to me that here's an example of an underlying work that's available for free. All the books there are in the public domain. That's how it operates. And maybe there might be some tarnishment going on here. Maybe if we hear a really badly read audiobook, somehow that affects our valuation of the underlying work. And the whole study allowed us to actually check a number of things. First of all, by looking at levels of exploitation of books. In other words, what books get made into audiobooks, we could either confirm or not confirm these findings from the 2008 and 2009 papers. We could also measure pricing, see if there's any pricing difference there. The two things we could do that were new would be to measure the quality of the recordings. Are recordings of public domain works worse than recordings of copyrighted works? In other words, they lack a shepherd. Maybe this leads to a degradation of the flock. And what would be really new would be to measure the effect of low quality recordings on value. Right? Is there really any sort of negative effect on value that's caused by a bad recording? Okay. So to sort of look at our findings in all four of these dimensions, we got complete confirmation of the previous studies. We used the same books, right? The same 171 books from 1913 to 1932, the same 173 books from 1923 to 1932. Of the earlier set of books that started to fall into the public domain in 1918, a third of them now have audiobook versions. And we're just looking on audible.com here, or Amazon or Barnes & Noble, so where you'd normally go to look for audiobooks. Audible actually has quite a monopoly. We could find almost no titles on Amazon or Barnes & Noble that weren't on Audible. Only 16%, though, of the copyrighted titles from 23 to 32 had been made into audiobooks. And this discrepancy even held with the very top titles, right? Only 80% of the top 20 copyrighted titles from this time period are audiobooks. Mutiny on the Bounty is still not an audiobook. Why? Because the publisher won't license somebody to make an audiobook. Lady Chatterley's Lover, this should actually be 85% because we finally have Lady Chatterley's Lover out in audiobook form. I haven't listened to it, but it came out last year, so this really should be 85% instead of 80%. But it's stunning that it takes so long for copyright owners, if they ever want to make a book available in audio form. Not surprisingly, 100% of the top 20 public domain titles are available in audiobook form. So nothing new there, at least in relation to the prior studies. The pricing data also replicates the prior studies. Interestingly, if you look at the full set of 171 public domain titles and 173 copyrighted titles, and you combine the price of the MP3 format or the CD format, right? Because each of these audiobooks usually comes in two formats. You get exactly the same price of $24. But again, if you break out the top 20 public domain titles, and the reason why we do this is because even Landis and Posner say there really shouldn't be any controversy about maintaining copyright protection for works that aren't popular, for works that really don't have any market value. Those should just be free for everybody to use. Their argument, and really all the economists' argument, is that valuable works that still hold significant market value for us, those are the ones that need to be protected. So that's why we break out the top 20 most popular public domain works and top 20 most popular copyrighted works. And when you do that, you do get a price discrepancy. For the public domain titles, it's 3.8 cents per minute on CD, 2.8 cents per minute in the MP3 format. But for the copyrighted titles, 5 cents a minute in CD format and 3.6 cents a minute for MP3 format. Per minute's the fairest way to measure this, right? Because not surprisingly, longer books cost more. That has nothing to do with their copyright or their public domain status. So we took the lowest price version on Audible and did the per minute pricing. And oddly, the percentage difference in price it mimics exactly the percentage difference in price of the same set of books in paperback form on Amazon. So it tracks pretty nicely. Again, nothing new. What's new is the fact that we're trying to get at these questions of quality and the effect of quality on price. In order to do that, you got to do a human subjects experiment. We pretended we were scientists and got Institutional Review Board approval because we wanted a large group of people to listen to professionally recorded copyrighted works, professionally recorded public domain works, and then the amateur recordings at LibriVox.org, and ask them a series of questions. Get responses from them about their listening experience and their perceived quality of the works. We did this kind of, you can go to Qualtrics.com, you can set up survey instruments there. It's really nice because their software does a lot of preliminary number crunching for you. So we set up the survey instrument on Qualtrics, and we recruited, initially, we did this a number of times, but just to make things simple, we recruited 500 Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. And I don't know if how many people have heard of the Amazon Mechanical Turk? All right, well, some people. Basically, any of you today, after this talk, can get online and become a worker for Amazon. As soon as you sign in and get a passcode, you will see literally thousands of tasks that you can do and get paid. Some of them are looking through 1,000 emails from a corporation to find particular words. Some of them are to watch proposed advertisements and answer questions about whether you like the advertisement or not. A lot of market survey research occurs on the Mechanical Turk because it's very cheap and exceedingly easy to do. Now, it sounds kind of cheesy that it might not be the greatest place to do academic research, right? So what we did, after each audiobook excerpt, we asked substantive questions about the reading, and then we threw out any responses of people who clearly had not listened to the recordings. And if people got 2 answers wrong for the entire set of 6 excerpts that they listened to, we threw out their data. We only had to throw out about 10% of Mechanical Turk data. These people really, really took it seriously. When we replicated exactly the same study in the traditional setting, you can pay Qualtrics to set up traditional research groups. We actually had to throw out way more data. So I actually have a suspicion, and there's been a couple of academic papers comparing Mechanical Turk. I actually become quite a fan because the data seem to actually be more reliable than what we were getting in the traditional human subject setting. So what were we measuring? What did we care about? Basically, this debasement argument seems to be based on 2 predictions, right? In the audiobook context, one is that recordings of public domain books will be of inferior quality because they lack owners. There's nobody there to monitor the recording and make sure a good reader is chosen. And 2, that if a recording is bad, if it's of inferior quality, then somehow that will have a negative effect on the underlying market value of the book, and that's the damage that is captured by this debasement. So we asked a lot of questions, of course, and I can talk more about exactly the format of the survey if you want me to, but the key questions really were questions 6 and 8. Question 6 gets at the quality of the reading. So we have a 6-point Likert scale here. You could rate a reader a 1. This reader could never produce a commercially acceptable audiobook. Or 6, this reader was excellent. And in the middle, this reader is close to good enough but still needs some improvement. We basically were pretending to be an audiobook firm recruiting readers. And the subjects were told, you're helping us decide which people to hire as our audiobook readers, and that's why we care about your responses to this question. We got permission to lie, and when they were done with the survey, we told them we were lying. So that's all cool as far as the ethics of research go. Question 8 was the best that we could do, and we asked a lot of psychologists, we asked a lot of economists, how do we get at the pricing question? And nobody was particularly happy with even their own suggestions. Most people thought this was okay. I'm still not enthusiastic about it, but we weren't able to come up with anything different. We pretended to have spare new paperback copies of the book, right? We will have many spare new paperback copies of this book when recording is concluded. How much should we sell these books for? Okay, that's what we got at the valuation. How much should we sell these books for? And keep in mind that the average price for new paperbacks in the U.S. is between $8 and $12, and all the psychologists agreed we needed to prompt them, and that would actually tie the scores in a way that would make the data more usable. So what did we get? Excuse me. Well, the LibriVox readings, the amateur readings, not surprisingly, the readers were rated significantly lower than either the public domain professional recordings or the copyright professional recordings. Remember that for almost all these books, there are professional recordings. You can get Treasure Island. You don't have to go to LibriVox and get it for free. You can get Treasure Island professional recording online as as a raw matter, the public domain readers actually ranks higher than copyrighted professional readers, although that difference is not statistically significant. As far as the price goes, there is a difference. The people who heard the LibriVox recordings, on average, established an $8 value for the books, whereas readers who heard these two types of recordings valued the books or said that we should sell them for a slightly higher price. Those numbers turn out not to be, the difference in those numbers turns out not to be statistically significant. That we don't need to get into. Getting towards the end, we had another set of recordings too that our subjects listened to. We thought that the ratings might be distorted by perhaps differences in how exciting the excerpts were. We chose sort of randomly 5-minute excerpts from chapter 5 of each of these books. And we were worried that, maybe some of the books are more exciting. There's more action in the first 5 minutes of chapter 5, and people's evaluation of the readers would be affected by the quality of the content as opposed to the quality of the reading. So we had a single guy named Alex read every single one of these 5-minute excerpts from chapter 5 for all the public domain works and all the copyrighted works. And interestingly, he scored almost exactly. He scored 3.48 on the public domain works and 3.57 on the copyright. Very close, no statistically significant difference. That indicates that content doesn't seem to be driving any of these numbers. And notice it's kind of fun. He scores, the LibriVox readers are 3.54, and Alex, our hand-picked amateur reader, scores almost exactly the same. So it looks like the relative attractiveness of what's in the excerpts doesn't play any role in determining what's significant in the data and what isn't. So I suppose these aren't tentative conclusions anymore, since the paper is going to come out in a couple of weeks. So actual conclusions. There's no significant difference between the quality of the professionally recorded public domain and professionally recorded copyrighted audiobooks. So the public domain status in this context doesn't make any difference at all in terms of the quality of the recording. However, whether somebody's a professional versus whether somebody's an amateur does matter. Right? So the status of the reader as opposed to the status of the copyright status of the work does matter. Again, that's probably not, I don't see any shocked faces out there. There is a significant positive correlation between the quality of the recording and the perceived value of the underlying book. No matter how many times we ran the experiment, our statistician assured us that, in fact, there is a relation. So if somebody hears a bad recording, they have a lower perceived underlying value of the book. I find this more credible in the movie context. I really think a bad movie deters people from reading the underlying book. I think that might in fact be true, and that might be a good new experiment. But it appears to a certain extent to be true in the audiobook market too, but very importantly for the debate over copyright term extension. There's no correlation between reader status or legal status of the book recorded and the value assigned by subjects. In other words, even though a bad reading led to a lower valuation, when you look at when you compare the status of all the readers and the legal status of the books, there's no correlation between public domain status and copyright status in terms of the pricing. So it doesn't look like the lack of protection for these works overall as a comprehensive matter in this particular market leads to any sort of tarnishment of the underlying public domain works. Finally, last slide. This debasement question is really interesting. You hear the argument a lot. It's hard to get your fingers around. People are dubious. It's also unclear what people are talking about, right? You could be talking about debasement in terms of the decreased market value for a particular work. When a work is debased, that particular work has a lower value. That's one thing it could mean. It could mean instead, though, that we have an overall decrease in public wealth. Now that's different, right? I think I was walking the other day, I was thinking of cell phones and their effect on watchmakers, right? I don't have a watch anymore. I don't need one. I have my cell phone in my pocket. And people increasingly use their cell phone as their watch or their clock. This hurts watch sales, right? Watches aren't as valuable as they used to be because of cell phones. Right? I mean, there's no argument here that we should get rid of cell phones to save the watch market. This is all part of Schumpeterian creative destruction. We see it happen all the time. We're not necessarily worried when a particular work or class of works loses value if there's offsetting value being created someplace else. This is the point about decreased public wealth. That's really what we should be caring about here. So even if we had found that a value of a particular work had dropped because of a bad reading, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something we should be worried about. It could just be markets working, and there could very well be an offset in increased wealth someplace else. We could, maybe if we were French, talk about debasement in terms of hurt artists' feelings, right? There might be sort of a moral rights component. We want to keep works in copyright to protect the feelings of the artists and their heirs, prevent them from being upset by a debasing derivative work. Or we could talk, and this is suggested by a guy named Justin Hughes, that works over time tend to get a set public meaning, and that public expects works to sort of have the same meaning over time, and we shouldn't let derivative works upset and recode that public meaning. I talked with somebody a couple of years ago who had seen a production of Porgy and Bess in Helsinki with an all-white cast. Right? So the Gershwin estate requires that every production of Porgy and Bess around the world have an all-black cast. So there can't be any Caucasians at all in the cast. Well, I guess it was hard in Helsinki to fill out the cast, so they committed blatant copyright infringement in this production. But the worry is that, well, doesn't that kind of a production recode the meaning of Porgy and Bess? It changes the meaning. It subverts it. We see this frequently in new productions of Shakespeare attempts to subvert accepted meanings of works. Maybe that's what people are worried about when they're talking about debasement. Again, it's not something I'm worried about. I'm from the University of Chicago. I like the free markets and meaning just like free markets and everything else. But the debasement debate is different, and it comes out differently. If what you're concerned about is hurt artists' feelings or recoded public meaning, you don't care about my data because it really doesn't answer your concerns. So I think I went on a little bit too long, but do we still have some time for questions? Yeah. Do I just...